Could you be my daughter just for one day? Marin Ashby went still in the middle of the room, the evening medicine tray still in her hands. In front of her, the woman in the wheelchair held her wrist and trembled. The oxygen line looped over her ears, thin fingers clutching the sleeve of a housekeeper's uniform, the way a person clutches a plank in open water. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't saying her last words. She only wanted to be a mother one more time. I know it's selfish of me. The old woman wept, tears sliding into the creases around her mouth. I know you have a mother of your own, but you walked into this room leaning a little on your left shoulder just the way she did. 12 years, and I've never had the courage to open that door. Outside, the last snow of the season came down slowly over the lawns of the Brennan estate. Inside, an old record player stood silent by the window, in the exact spot it used to stand before the night the youngest daughter never came home. And in the doorway behind Marin, a man was standing. No one knew how long he had been there. His car keys were still in his hand, his knuckles white around them. The woman in the wheelchair was his mother. The girl whose wrist she was holding worked for him. And this whole city of Chicago, from the 3 shipping yards along the river to the trucks that ran at night and were never stopped by anyone, belonged to the name Brennan. The keys fell to the wooden floor. Marin turned around. But what happened after she nodded to that dying woman was the part no one saw coming. It all started the day a daughter opened a door that had been locked for 12 years, uncovering a blue file that 3 men had died to bury, only to find her own father's name on the 4th line, a life buried beneath 3 tons of steel at Pier 9. If this story reaches something in you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever came to mind, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with us. 3 months before the night the ring of keys fell onto the wooden floor, Cormac Brennan stood with his back to the 7 men in the top-floor conference room of Brennan Freight and Logistics, looking down at the city of Chicago as it shifted in color beyond the thick glass. Outside, the river churned beneath a cold, leaden sky. Barges crawled slowly southward as though they had been moving that way since before anyone in this room was born. Inside, no one poured another cup of coffee. No one pulled out a chair. At the far end of the table, the accountant Nolan Frayne sat with his shoulders drawn inward behind a stack of ledgers, and throughout the entire meeting, he didn't once dare lift his head. Today's guest was a port safety inspector named Gerald Pruitt, a man with salt and pepper hair, a tie knotted a little too tightly, and 2 hands that kept settling on the tabletop, retreating to his lap, then returning again. He talked about procedure. He talked for a long time. He said things were different now, that there were new forms, new layers of cross-checking, that the federal office was tightening its grip more than ever before. He talked about pressure from his superiors, about how people were examining every seal now, about how his wife had just left her job at the hospital, and he couldn't afford to take risks. His voice climbed a little higher with every sentence, the kind of rising voice that belonged to a man trying to convince himself that he was being reasonable. Cormac didn't turn around. He let the man finish. It was one of his habits, and the men seated in that room had learned long ago that Cormac Brennan's silence wasn't empty space. It was a scale. When Gerald Pruitt finally ran out of words, and the only sound left in the room was the low hum of the heating system inside the walls, Cormac turned around. He didn't sit down. From the folder in front of him, he removed 2 sheets of paper, laid them on the polished tabletop, and gently pushed them toward the seated man. Not quickly, not forcefully, just enough for the papers to slide directly into his line of sight. The first was a copy of the mortgage agreement on his house in Beverly, with 22 years still left to pay. The second was a pension statement from the Port Authority, bearing his name, his retirement age, and a column showing medical benefits for his spouse. Gerald Pruitt lowered his eyes. He didn't touch the papers. His fingertips curled against the tabletop, as though he had just brushed against something colder than he had expected. Cormac spoke, his voice remaining at exactly the same level, without rising even half a note. You've got 11 years left before retirement. I like working with people who still have a lot of years ahead of them. They tend to calculate more carefully. The conference room became so quiet that someone could hear a pen rolling softly across the tabletop before coming to a stop. Gerald Pruitt looked up at Cormac, and in that moment, he understood something he would lie awake thinking about later that night. The man standing in front of him hadn't threatened him at all. He had simply shown him his own life, neatly arranged on 2 sheets of paper, and left him to do the rest himself. Pruitt took a pen from his breast pocket. He signed. His signature trembled on the final stroke. No one in the room stood up. No one touched him, and no one said another word to him. Cormac gave the slightest nod, and Barrett Kilgore rose to open the door for their guest as though he were seeing out an old friend. Gerald Pruitt stepped into the hallway with his briefcase clutched against his chest, then closed the door behind him very softly, almost politely, with the careful courtesy of a man trying not to disturb the thing that had just chosen to spare him. When the sound of his footsteps had completely faded down the corridor, Barrett turned and asked whether they should have someone follow him for a few weeks. Cormac turned the plain silver ring on the little finger of his left hand once, then stopped. "No need," he said. "A man who still has something to lose will watch himself." Then he picked up the folder, tucked it beneath his arm, and walked out of the room before anyone else, leaving behind 6 men still seated exactly where they were, and an accountant at the far end of the table, who finally dared lift his head only after the door had closed. Around that same time, roughly 10 miles south of Brennan Freight's glass tower, Marin Ashby was wiping down the last row of desks on an empty office floor along Wacker, and when she peeled off her rubber gloves, Dawn still hadn't broken. She pushed her cart into the supply closet, signed her name on the timesheet, then stepped out onto the street into the lingering cold of March, the kind of cold that didn't bite the skin so much as slip beneath a coat and stay there. The first bus of the day carried people just like her, people heading home from work while everyone else was getting ready to begin theirs, people nodding off with bags clutched against their chests. Marin didn't sleep. She sat close to the window, watching the city recede behind her, silently counting the same numbers she had counted over and over for the past 3 years. Maple Crest Nursing Home stood near the western edge of the city, a row of low brown tiled buildings behind a white wooden fence, with a lawn that hadn't managed to turn green yet this season. Inside, the smell of disinfectant mingled with the scent of toast drifting from the kitchen. And in the common room, an old upright piano stood against the wall with its lid always closed. Her mother was sitting in her usual chair beside the window, her hair now completely white and neatly combed by someone's careful hands. Marin pulled over a chair, sat down, placed her hand over the back of her mother's, and knew from the very first second that this was going to be a bad day. Delia Ashby looked at her with polite, distant eyes, the kind of look someone gave a nurse they had never met before. Then, in a soft and eager voice, she asked whether Marin happened to know her daughter. "Her girl was such a wonderful pianist," she said. "Everyone at school used to say so. She could hear a piece of music once and play it back immediately." Marin kept her own hand from tightening. She said, "Yes, ma'am, I know her." She said, "I've heard her play. She's very good." Delia nodded, pleased, then turned back toward the window and began telling her about some winter recital whose details she remembered almost entirely wrong. Marin listened to all of it. She adjusted the scarf around her mother's shoulders, asked whether she had eaten breakfast, then sat with her a while longer without saying anything at all. When Marin finally stood to leave, Delia waved goodbye cheerfully, as though she were seeing off a kind visitor. Out in the front hallway, the facility's accounting manager, a middle-aged woman with thin framed glasses named Marlene Odom, called her aside. She invited Marin into her office, closed the door, then sat in silence for a moment before speaking. And it was that silence more than anything that made Marin's insides go cold. For the past 3 years, Marlene explained, an envelope had arrived in the mail every month. Inside was cash. No letter, no sender's name. And the amount had always matched Delia's bill exactly. Not a penny short, and not a penny over. This month, the envelope hadn't come. Marlene pushed a notice across the desk. 30 days. After 30 days, if no one paid the balance, the facility would be forced to begin the process of transferring Delia to a city-run public home on the south side, where the waiting list was so long that people often waited an entire year. Marin stared at the paper without reading a single word. In a voice so steady that it surprised even her, she asked whether anyone had ever come in and paid in person. Marlene thought for a moment, then stood and took an old visitor ledger from a cabinet, its blue cover worn at the corners, and flipped backward to the earliest pages. Once, a very long time ago, almost at the very beginning, during the first month, a man had come in and paid cash. He had stood at the counter for less than 5 minutes and hadn't asked for a receipt. His signature was a scrawl no one had ever been able to make out, not even a single letter. In the box, asking for his relationship to the patient, he had written 3 words, pressing the pen so hard into the paper that the marks had nearly cut through. Nothing at all. And in the box for a contact number, He had left a string of digits. Marlene pointed to it and said she had tried calling once, only to thank him, but the number led to a switchboard. Marin bent over and stared at that number for a long time. She had seen it before. It was printed beneath the trailers that rolled along the expressways every night. It was stamped across the sides of containers stacked along the river. It was everywhere in the city, so common that people had stopped noticing it at all. Brennan Freight and Logistics. That evening, in their 2-room apartment on the 3rd floor in Bridgeport, Wes sat at the edge of the kitchen table listening as his sister told him everything. Then he stood up and said he would take the semester off. A warehouse out near the Beltway was hiring for the night shift, and 3 months of work would be enough to cover the bill. Marin said no. He told her she couldn't carry everything by herself. She still said no, and this time she said it in the tone he knew meant there was nothing left to argue about. That night, she sat for a long time beside the window with her phone resting in her lap. She didn't have a plan. She only needed money, and she wanted to know. The next morning, in the job listings at an employment agency she still checked every week, there was an advertisement for a live-in maid for a family on the North Shore. Discretion required. Care for an elderly person. The pay was 3 times what she was making now. Marin filled out the application, signed her name, and didn't ask why anyone would pay so much. They called her back only 2 days later, and on Monday morning that week, Marin stepped off the bus at the beginning of the paved road leading into the North Shore, pulling a cloth suitcase with worn handles behind her. The iron gates, taller than a man, opened without a sound. Patches of late-season snow still lay untouched across the long lawn because no one had walked through them. The house stood at the end of the drive, silent as a church whose doors had been locked for years. And in that stillness, the sound of the suitcase wheels rattling over the gravel seemed so loud that Marin finally lifted it and carried it. The woman who opened the door had silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, a straight back, and an apron so perfectly pressed there wasn't a wrinkle in it. Her name was Gwendolyn Pike, and she didn't offer Marin her hand. She led her down the hallway, always half a step ahead, never looking back, speaking in the flat, measured voice of someone reading a sentence rather than explaining house rules. In this house, she said, no one asked where the money came from. The east wing didn't open. The door was locked, and the key wasn't kept anywhere Marin could reach it. And one last thing. At the foot of the staircase, Gwendolyn stopped and turned to look at Marin for the first time since opening the gate. No one surprised Mr. Brennan twice. Marin asked what happened the first time. Gwendolyn studied her for a moment, then said that the first time, people were still allowed to leave through the front door. Marin's room was in the attic, beneath a sloping ceiling, with one small window overlooking the roof of the greenhouse behind the garden. At noon, B. Nowak, a woman in her 40s who ran the kitchen, pressed a sandwich wrapped in wax paper into Marin's hand and told her to eat so she'd have some strength. Then she lowered her voice and added 3 things she said she'd learned from 11 years in that house. Do your work. Don't ask anything you don't need to ask. And don't look the boss directly in the eyes. Marin asked why. B shrugged and said it wasn't because he would do anything to her. It was because he would remember her face. And in this house, being remembered wasn't always a good thing. That afternoon, Marin was taken upstairs to meet the lady of the house. The bedroom door on the 2nd floor stood open only a hand's breadth. Inside, the room was dark. There was the faint sound of a breathing machine, and a woman's rough, hoarse voice came from somewhere beyond the doorway, telling them to leave it there and go away. Gwendolyn didn't seem surprised. She told Marin to place the tray on the small table outside the door and record the time in the logbook. Then she added that Marin was the 5th one, meaning the 5th person hired to care for the woman in the past 3 months, and none of the 4 before her had lasted more than 3 weeks. The first night passed quietly until close to midnight, when Marin carried a tray of medicine and a glass of water along the 2nd floor corridor. She wasn't used to the thick carpet. The toe of her shoe caught on its edge, and the tray slipped from her hands. The porcelain cup shattered against the wooden floor, the crack of it rising all the way to the ceiling before disappearing into the heavy silence of the house. And Marin dropped to her knees, her heart pounding in her throat as she hurriedly gathered the broken pieces into her palms. A door opened at the far end of the hallway. She looked up and saw a man step out, still wearing a black wool coat, his hands bare. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He walked toward her, bent down, and picked up the largest shard of porcelain with his bare hand, carefully, the way someone might pick up something that could still be useful. Then he asked her name. Marin gave him both her first and last name because she assumed that in this house, when someone asked a question, you were expected to answer it completely. Marin Ashby, and she saw him go still for exactly the length of one breath. Only one breath. No longer. Not a single muscle in his face changed. No other question followed. But for one brief moment, his hand stopped in midair, with the porcelain shard resting in his palm, and Marin, because she was kneeling, and because she was frightened, didn't notice. He handed the shard to her, lowering it gently into her palm, then told her not to let Mrs. Gwen see this spot because she'd dock her pay. After that, he stood and walked straight down the stairs without looking back, and the front door closed behind him so softly that Marin thought she might have imagined the sound. She remained sitting on the floor for a little while longer, still holding the broken pieces in her hands, unable to understand why she was trembling so badly when the man hadn't raised his voice even once. That same night, inside the car beneath the blue glow of the dashboard, Cormac called Barrett Kilgore and asked who had approved the new employee's file. Barrett said the lady of the house had. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Barrett finally asked whether he wanted someone to run another background check. Cormac looked through the car window at the house standing dark behind the rows of bare trees, and at last he said, "Leave it alone." Then he added one more sentence, more slowly than the first, "And don't let anyone touch her." The next morning, Gwendolyn handed Marin a typed sheet listing the lady of the house's medication schedule, and at the bottom, written by hand in blue ink, was a short note saying that if she refused to eat, Marin was to report it immediately and not try to coax her. Bea told her more in the kitchen, speaking softly while she chopped onions, that the first caregiver had been dismissed for opening the curtains without permission, the second for telling Maeve that she had to keep fighting for her son, the third for turning on the television, and the fourth simply for standing at the foot of the bed and staring at her too long. The lady of the house was named Maeve Brennan, and in 3 months she had sent all 4 of them out the door, without raising her voice even once, exactly like her son. That afternoon, the lunch tray was carried upstairs and brought back down untouched. Dinner was the same. The afternoon blister pack still held all 4 pills inside their plastic compartment, and the glass of water beside it was still filled to the same mark. Marin didn't say anything to anyone. Late that night, she went down to the kitchen, reheated a bowl of thin chicken soup, chopped a little parsley into it, and carried it upstairs. She knocked twice, waited, heard no answer, and opened the door anyway. Inside, only one lamp was on in the corner. The woman sat in her wheelchair with her back to the door, facing the window, the oxygen tubing looped over her ears, both hands resting motionless in her lap. Marin didn't walk around to stand in front of her. She didn't open the curtains, didn't turn on another light, and didn't ask how she was feeling. She went to the small table against the wall, set the bowl of soup near the edge, laid the spoon horizontally across a paper napkin, then stepped back once. In the same ordinary voice she might have used to talk about the weather, she said that if Maeve got hungry later, it would still be there. Then she turned, closed the door behind her, and went downstairs to finish the rest of her work. The old woman didn't say a word. As Marin left, she heard behind her the faintest sound of someone shifting position in a wheelchair. Nothing more, and she didn't turn around. That night, she slept for 4 hours. The next morning, when she went upstairs to clean the room, the bowl was sitting exactly where she had left it, near the edge of the table, with the spoon still lying across the paper napkin. It was clean. There wasn't a drop left at the bottom. Marin picked it up, placed it on the tray, and carried it downstairs. She didn't say anything to Bea. She didn't say anything to Gwendolyn either, when the older woman asked how Maeve had been the night before. Marin only said, "Fine, ma'am," then went to wash the tray. At lunch that day, she brought up another bowl, a different dish this time, and did exactly what she had done the night before. Set it near the edge of the table, laid the spoon across the napkin, stepped back once. She didn't say anything this time because this time, nothing needed to be said. By the afternoon, when she returned for the tray, more than half the bowl was gone. On the 3rd day, the woman in the wheelchair spoke to her for the first time. She didn't turn around. She only asked which number Marin was. Marin said, "I'm the 5th, ma'am." The old woman asked how long she thought she would last. Marin answered, "I haven't thought about it. I've only been here 3 days." The old woman said nothing more, and Marin didn't ask anything else. She set the bowl down, placed the spoon beside it, stepped back, and left. 4 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, Marin brought up the blister pack as usual. She placed it neatly beside the glass of water, then did something no one had told her to do, and no one had forbidden. She left the room. She didn't stand at the foot of the bed. She didn't linger in the doorway. She didn't stay in the hallway listening. She went straight downstairs and folded towels in the linen room for 20 minutes. When she came back upstairs, the afternoon compartment was empty. All 4 pills gone, and the glass of water was half empty. Marin picked up the glass, washed it, turned it upside down on the rack, and didn't say a single word about it to anyone in that house. In the second week, Gwendolyn assigned her to clean out the basement storage room, and she made it clear that Marin was only to clean, not throw anything away without asking first. It was cold down there, with a low ceiling, dust covers that had faded to the color of ash, and in the farthest corner, behind a stack of cardboard boxes filled with old curtains, Marin found a record player sitting on a rosewood stand. The dust on its lid was so thick that when she pressed a finger against it, she left behind a groove as clear as a chalk mark. Beside the player stood a box of vinyl records stored upright, their glossy paper sleeves peeling at the edges, and on top was a piano record that someone had carefully slipped into an inner sleeve and then forgotten there. Marin stood looking at it longer than she needed to. That afternoon, she wiped away the dust with a damp cloth, cleaned every groove in the wood, then carried the player upstairs to the second floor with both hands, taking the stairs slowly, one step at a time. She set it on the low table beside the window where the light fell, and she didn't say a word. The old woman sat in her wheelchair a few steps away, turned her head to look, and Marin saw both of her hands tighten around the edge of the blanket covering her lap. "That thing's been broken for 12 years, she said, her voice dry as a door that hadn't been opened in a very long time. Marin was still bent over, adjusting one of the table legs until it sat evenly, and she answered as lightly as though they were talking about a kettle. "Then I suppose it's had enough rest, ma'am." The old woman didn't say another word. That evening, Marin asked Bea if she could borrow the toolbox kept in the cabinet beneath the sink, and she sat on the floor of her room until late into the night, removing the cover from the player, taking out the needle that had bent and broken at the tip, cleaning the sliding track, and placing a single drop of oil on the spindle. Inside the old record box was a small paper envelope containing 3 replacement needles, yellowed with age but never used. The next morning, she carried everything back upstairs, and this time she did all of it right in front of the old woman. Without asking permission, and without explaining herself, she installed a new needle. She took a felt cloth and wiped the surface of the record in slow circles, from the center outward, the same way her father used to clean the metal discs in his workshop years ago. Then she placed the record on the turntable, moved the lever, and lowered the needle. There was a long hiss that lasted about 2 seconds, the sound of something very old trying to remember what it had once known how to do, and then everything went silent. The turntable made another half rotation and stopped. Marin didn't try a second time. She lifted the needle, closed the lid, and said, "I'll find a few more things and keep working on it." She carried the tray downstairs, finished the rest of her morning duties, and when she returned close to noon, the old woman was still sitting in exactly the same place, facing the record player. By afternoon, she was still there. She finished every bite of her lunch without anyone having to remind her. Late that evening, when Marin came in to clear the room and turn off some of the lights, the old woman spoke, and this time she turned and looked directly at her. She asked whether Marin knew how to play the piano. Marin stopped what she was doing. "A little, ma'am. I'm not very good anymore, but I used to teach." The old woman asked whom she had taught. Marin said she had taught music at a public school on the south side for 7 years, mostly to children who had never touched an instrument before. The school had 18 pianos, and 7 of them had broken keys. The old woman asked why she had left. Marin said the program budget had been cut, all of it at once, and by the end of the school year the entire music room had been turned into storage for desks and chairs. The old woman was silent for a long time. Then she turned back toward the window and said slowly, almost as though she were speaking to herself, "They always start by cutting the things that can't be measured." Marin didn't answer that. She pulled the door closed behind her and walked away, leaving the record player exactly where it was, beside the window, beneath the place where the light fell. That same night, more than 20 miles south of the North Shore house, along the stretch of river that ran through the old industrial district, someone cut the seals on 3 Brennan freight containers, just as the night shift changed watch. Barrett Kilgore called Cormac while the sky was still completely dark, and within 6 minutes he was in the car. Pier 9 sat at the end of a concrete road streaked with dried mud, with wind coming hard off the water and sweeping across rows of containers stacked 3 high. When the black car stopped, the headlight of a crane working the night shift moved slowly across the tops of the containers, then drifted away. On the door of the first container, the lead seal had been cut clean through in a single stroke, the steel wire still hanging loose and swinging whenever the wind struck it. Sullivan Rourke stood waiting beneath it with 9 of his men, both hands in the pockets of his coat, and he smiled when he saw Cormac step out of the car alone, with Barrett following 3 paces behind. He said he only wanted to see what was inside, that he was just curious, and in this part of town, curiosity had never been a crime. Cormac didn't answer that. He didn't look at Rourke's face, and he didn't look at the 9 men standing behind him. He walked over to an overturned plastic crate near the foot of the container, set a stiff-backed file folder on top of it, opened it, and began laying out sheets of paper one by one across the plastic surface like a man dealing cards onto a table. The first was the lease agreement for the warehouse on Cicero that Rourke was using for storage. With 14 months remaining on the term, owned by a real estate company no one on the South Side had ever heard of. The second was a copy of his commercial transportation license, with pencil notes in the margin beside 3 items that hadn't been renewed. The third was a typed list, creditors in the left column, amounts in the right, due dates in the final column, with 4 lines underlined. Cormac let the wind lift the edges of the pages. Then he spoke, his voice no louder than the sound of the water striking the retaining wall. You've got 2 days to put the shipment back where it belongs. Seals intact, count intact. After 2 days, I buy the warehouse you're standing in, and you'll have to ask my permission to go inside and get your coat. Rourke stopped smiling. He looked down at the 3 sheets of paper, and what darkened his face wasn't the numbers written there, but the realization that the man standing in front of him had already had them in the car before he ever left home. One of the men behind Rourke stepped forward, swept a hand behind his coat, and rushed him. Barrett stopped him halfway across the pavement, turned, drove him down onto the concrete, and held him there. It all happened so cleanly that it was over before a full breath had passed, and none of the other 9 men had time to move. Barrett didn't tighten his hold. He simply kept the man down and looked up at Rourke, waiting. Cormac didn't even turn his head. He closed the file folder, left the 3 sheets where they were on top of the plastic crate, and added one final sentence. Those are copies. Keep them. Read them. Then he removed his gloves, the left one first, finger by finger, pulling it free from his wrist, folding it once, and placing it inside his coat pocket before doing the same with the right. He did it slowly, not to frighten anyone, but because that was how he always did it when something was finished. Barrett released the man and stood. The man scrambled backward on his own, and no one helped him up. When Cormac and Barrett got back into the car, Rourke was still standing beneath the severed seal hanging loose above him, the 3 sheets of paper in his hand. The crane light swept across the pier once more, illuminating his face for a single moment before leaving him in darkness again. On the drive back, Barrett asked whether they needed someone watching the warehouse on Cicero. Cormac said no. The shipment would be back in full within 2 days. Barrett asked how he could be so sure. Cormac looked out through the window, where the eastern sky was beginning to pale, and said, because he just finished reading the right-hand column. The shipment came back half a day before the deadline. Seals intact, count intact, exactly as Cormac had said it would. But along with the cargo came a question no one in the company wanted to ask aloud, and that was how Rourke's men had known exactly which 3 containers were worth cutting open out of more than 40 sitting at the pier that night. It took Barrett 4 days to trace the answer. The man's name was Emmett Doyle. He had worked as a route coordinator for Brennan Freight for 9 years, and owned a small repair shop on Ashland that he had opened with his savings, and a loan he still hadn't finished paying off. He hadn't taken any money from Rourke. He had only talked in a bar after 4 drinks, wanting to sound like a man who knew things, and the price of sounding like a man who knew things was something he had never thought to calculate. That evening, Cormac sat in his first-floor office with the door left slightly open, and he made 3 phone calls. The first lasted less than 2 minutes. It was to someone at a local bank, about the loan on the repair shop on Ashland, and about the small clause printed on the back of the agreement that allowed the lender to demand payment in full if the borrower's employment status changed. The second call went to the owner of the building where the Doyle family rented their home, and it was even shorter than the first. On the third call, Cormac didn't say much at all. He read out a name, listened, said thank you, and hung up. By the next morning, throughout the entire area from the river southward, there wasn't a warehouse, a trucking company, or a way station willing to hire Emmett Doyle. No one touched him. No one spoke a single threat to him. By early evening the following day, he came to the North Shore house on his own. Marin was walking upstairs with a basket of freshly folded towels when she stopped at the upper landing at the sound of the front door opening. From there, she looked down into the foyer and saw a man standing in the middle of the tiled floor, his coat still marked with engine grease, a wool cap clutched in his hands, and she watched his knees give way. He knelt right there in the middle of the foyer and began talking quickly, saying he had 3 children, saying he hadn't taken a single dollar from the other side, saying he had only been running his mouth in a bar, and he swore that was all it had been. He begged to be allowed to keep the shop. Cormac stood in the doorway of his office about 5 steps away, both hands in his coat pockets. He didn't move toward him. He didn't bend down. He looked straight past the kneeling man toward the front door and spoke in exactly the same voice Marin had heard in the hallway the night she broke the cup, not even half a note louder. "You still have both your legs," he said. "You still have your name, and you're still allowed to walk out of here through the front door. In this business, a lot of men don't get to keep all 3. Don't make me reconsider." Emmett Doyle fell silent. He stood up very slowly, like a man who had just understood that every word he said from that point forward could only make things worse, then gave a single nod to the man who still wasn't even looking at him. He turned and opened the door. Barrett didn't escort him out. No one did. The door closed, and the only sound left in the foyer was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Cormac turned back into his office and closed the door. He never looked up. He didn't know that at the top of the staircase, a woman was standing perfectly still with a basket of towels held against her chest, and that she had been there from the beginning. That night, Marin didn't go down to the kitchen for dinner. She sat on the edge of the bed in her attic room with the light off, a narrow wash of blue from the garden lamp falling through the small window. She thought about 3 children she had never met. She thought about the 30-day notice folded into quarters inside the drawer beneath the foot of her bed, and about the number written in the old blue visitor ledger at Maplecrest, the number that everyone in this city seemed to know. Then she lifted one hand to the edge of the bedside table, and her fingertips began tapping very softly to the rhythm of an old song her father used to whistle in the workshop, over and over again, until the sky was nearly light. For the next several days, Marin worked like someone who had learned how not to see. She wiped down the stairs, folded towels, carried trays upstairs and brought them back down again. And every time she crossed the tiled foyer on the first floor, she found herself walking a little faster. The old woman upstairs didn't ask what was wrong. But one afternoon, while Marin was wiping the window frame and the lowering sun outside was turning the entire room the color of burnished copper, the old woman told her to come closer. She slipped one hand beneath the thin cushion supporting her back in the wheelchair and pulled out a brass key. It was small, worn smooth along both edges of the head, and warm from having rested there for so long. She didn't explain. She simply placed it in Marin's palm and told her to wheel her to the east wing. Marin stood still. She told her that Mrs. Gwendolyn had said the east wing wasn't to be opened. The old woman looked at her, and for the first time since Marin had arrived, something very slight moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile. She said that rule had been made by someone else, but the key belonged to her. The east wing corridor was shorter than Marin had expected, and colder than the rest of the house. The lock gave a protesting scrape when she turned the key, and the door opened into a long glass room with a curved ceiling, its broad panes coated in such a fine layer of dust that the late afternoon light filtering through them had become pale, muted, and still. Along the walls, plants that had died years ago remained in their pots, their dried stems curled like unfinished lines of handwriting. In the center of the room stood an upright piano beneath a white cloth that had long since faded to gray. Beside it was a wooden music stand, and resting on that stand was an open sheaf of handwritten music. The ink faded with age, the staffs continuing neatly until halfway down the second page, where they stopped in the middle of a measure, with no final bar, nothing after it. Marin wheeled the old woman into the center of the room, then stepped back once and left everything as it was. Dust rose into the shaft of light, turned slowly in the air, then settled again. The old woman sat very straight, both hands resting in her lap. She looked at the covered piano for a long time, then spoke in a voice so calm that Marin had to hear the words again inside her own mind before she fully understood them. "My daughter's name was Rosalind," she said. "She called me and asked me to come get her. I told her to let her brother go instead." Then she said nothing more. She turned toward the great glass panes overlooking the garden, where the last snow of the season still lay in narrow patches beneath the bare trees, and she kept staring out there without blinking, with the look of someone still waiting for a person to appear along the path outside at any moment. Marin didn't ask a single question. She didn't ask where Rosalind was now, didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask why the room had been locked. She stood behind the wheelchair with both hands resting on its handles, and she stayed there until the last of the daylight withdrew from the glass and the entire room sank into the color of ash. When she wheeled the old woman back out and locked the door again, the brass key was still in Marin's hand. The old woman didn't ask for it back. Without turning around, she only said, "Keep it." The following night, Marin went back to the glass room alone. She brought the record player, the old box of records, a bucket of warm water, and several cloths, because she thought that if the old woman ever wanted to go in there again, then at the very least the room ought to be less dusty. She cleaned the glass from the inside, one pane at a time, and left the door open so the room wouldn't feel so stifling. It was because the door was open that he saw the light. Marin heard footsteps along the stone corridor and straightened, still holding the wet cloth in one hand, already preparing both an apology and the possibility that she would be dismissed that very night. Cormac stopped in the doorway. He looked inside, at the piano beneath its cloth, at the music stand, at the dead plants in their pots, and he stood there so long that Marin thought he would turn away. Then he stepped inside. He walked past her as though he hadn't seen her, went to the piano, and sat down on the low bench in front of it. He didn't remove the cloth. He didn't place his hands on the lid. He only sat there with his elbows resting on his knees, looking down at the wooden floor. Marin didn't ask anything. She didn't leave either. She set the cloth on the rim of the bucket, sat down on the brick step at the far end of the room, and waited, because she had learned in that house that there were certain silences which, once broken, might never open again. He spoke first. He said people had told him the girl had gone out that night, and for 12 years he had let them say it that way. Then he told her the truth. Rosie hadn't gone out for fun. She was 19, in her second year of college, and for the entire week before that night, she had kept asking him questions he had dismissed as a child's curiosity. Why did the company trucks run that route at that hour? Why were there shipments that didn't appear on the schedule? Why were there names on the paperwork that she had never once heard anyone mention at home? He had brushed her off. He had patted her on the head. That night, she sat down at the desktop computer in their father's study, found the folder where the cargo manifests were stored, and printed them. She folded the pages into the pocket of her coat, took the car keys, and drove downtown, straight to the company building, where he was sitting in a meeting on an upper floor with 6 men and a whiteboard covered in routes. He said she didn't call him. She didn't send a message. She simply drove there, because she knew that if she called, he would tell her to leave it until tomorrow. And she had grown tired of hearing those 2 words. She meant to put those pages on the table in front of him and make him look at them. The accident happened at an intersection exactly 3 blocks from the building. He reached that point and stopped for a very long time. Then he said the last sentence, more slowly than everything that had come before it. She almost made it. Marin sat motionless on the brick step. She didn't say anything like, "You couldn't have known," and she didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," because she knew there were things people said only to make themselves feel less uncomfortable, words that did nothing at all for the person who had to hear them. She asked only one question, very softly. "Where are those papers now?" He didn't answer. He stood up, and as he passed her at the far end of the room, he told her not to keep cleaning because it was late. Then he stepped into the corridor, and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded away. Marin remained there alone among the panes of glass she had just cleaned, and the dead plants in their pots. A long while later, she stood, walked over to the record player she had brought down, slipped the piano record from its sleeve, placed it on the turntable, moved the lever, and lowered the needle. There was a hiss, and then there was music. It truly came. A slow melody, slightly out of tune in the opening passage, but steady for nearly half of one side of the record, and Marin stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Halfway through the piece, the sound began to thin, the turntable slowed, and then everything faded into silence. Out in the corridor, only a few steps away, a man had stopped the moment the first note sounded, leaning back against the wall in the darkness, and he remained there until the room had gone completely quiet before continuing on. "Could you be my daughter just for one day?" The old woman's tearful plea still hung in the air as the ring of keys lay motionless on the wooden floor, and no one bent down to pick it up. Marin eased her hand out of the old woman's very slowly, as carefully as someone separating something that might break, and laid Maeve's hand back onto the blanket covering her lap. "I'll be right back, ma'am," she said, and the old woman nodded, still breathing hard, still looking at her as though the moment Marin stepped beyond the doorway, she might simply disappear. Cormac said nothing inside the room. He only turned into the hallway, and Marin followed. About 10 steps from the door, he stopped and leaned his back against the wall, and when he spoke, his voice was flat, so completely flat that there wasn't the slightest ripple in it, the voice of metal that had gone entirely cold. "Tomorrow morning, pack your things," he said. "Keep the full month's pay. A car will take you to the station." Marin didn't argue. She stood there with both hands hanging at her sides, and she thought of the notice folded into quarters inside the drawer beneath the foot of her bed, thought of the 30 days that had now dwindled to less than 2 weeks, thought of Wes and the warehouse out near the Beltway. She thought of all of it in less time than it took to draw a breath, and then she said yes. "Yes, sir." Then she said a second thing, no louder than the first, "But you go in there and tell her. Don't make me do that for you." Cormac looked at her. No one in that house had ever spoken to him in that tone, not because it was disrespectful, but because it wasn't asking him for anything. He didn't answer. He turned and walked back down the hallway toward the door that was still slightly open, and Marin remained where she was, watching him. He stopped outside his mother's room. He lifted one hand to the doorknob. Inside, there was the faint sound of the breathing machine, and the sound of a woman trying to steady her breathing after she had cried. His hand rested on the brass knob, and stayed there. Marin counted silently. She counted past 30. He didn't turn the knob. He didn't knock. At last, he lowered his hand, walked straight past the door, went downstairs, and the door to his first-floor office closed behind him. That night, Marin packed. She didn't have much. One cloth suitcase and a paper bag holding an old pair of shoes. She folded her uniform, laid it neatly on the table, and placed the brass key on top because she thought it wouldn't be right to keep it. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she didn't cry. She simply sat there, while beyond the small window, the glass-house roof behind the garden lay silver beneath the moonlight. It was very late when someone knocked on her door. 3 knocks. Unhurried, Marin opened it and found him standing at the top of the attic stairs, still wearing his coat, his hair damp because sleet had begun falling outside. He didn't step into the room. He held out an envelope. She took it without opening it. "Tomorrow," he said. "She wants to go tomorrow. I spoke to the doctor. 4 hours outside, no more. She needs the wheelchair for any long distance, and the moment she gets tired, we come straight back." Then he added 3 more words, speaking them like a statement rather than an offer. "I'll drive us." Marin stood still. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, then back at him, and asked why he had changed his mind. He didn't answer immediately. He looked past her shoulder into the small attic room, at the closed suitcase sitting on the bed, and Marin saw his jaw shift once. Then he said, "In 12 years, I haven't heard my mother ask anyone for anything." He said she hadn't begged the doctors. She hadn't begged his father while he was still alive. She hadn't begged him, even when she had every right to. And tonight I stood outside that door and heard her beg someone she's only known for a few weeks. He stopped. "Don't misunderstand me," he continued, his voice flat again. "This doesn't change anything. But if she finally opened her mouth and asked, I'm not going to be the one who shuts it." Marin nodded. "I understand, sir." He had gone down 2 steps when he stopped, and without turning around, he added one last thing. "She doesn't get to know I told you to pack." Then he went downstairs. Marin closed the door and stood with her back against it for a long time before opening the envelope. There was no money inside, only a sheet of paper folded in half, handwritten with the name of a bakery in Bridgeport, and beneath it, in smaller letters, 3 words: apricot-filled pastries. The next morning, the old woman insisted on wearing the red coat. It was kept in the closet at the end of the hallway inside a cloth garment bag, and Gwendolyn had to stand on a chair to reach it. When Marin helped Maeve slide her arms into the sleeves, she saw that the shoulders of the coat were 2 finger widths broader than the woman wearing it, but the old woman wouldn't allow anyone to bring her another one. Then she told Marin to get the makeup case from the bottom drawer, and she put on lipstick, slowly, her hand trembling slightly at the left corner of her mouth. for the first time in 2 years. B stood at the foot of the staircase watching them leave, then turned away and wiped down the stove even though the surface was already clean. The bakery stood on a corner in Bridgeport, its blue-painted wooden door peeling in patches, with only 6 tables inside, and the smell from the ovens drifting all the way out to the sidewalk. Marin pushed the wheelchair over the threshold, and the old woman looked around once before, saying that nothing had changed, not even the hanging lamp, which still tilted to the left exactly as it always had. The woman behind the counter was elderly, her hair tied beneath a scarf, and when Marin asked whether they had any apricot-filled pastries left, she said there were only 2. They took just one. The old woman insisted on one, then broke it in half right there on the wax paper, handed the larger piece to Marin, and kept the smaller half for herself. She said her girl used to do exactly the same thing, always trying to break it so the other person got the bigger piece, and somehow always breaking it unevenly. Then she didn't say anything more about her daughter. The 2 women sat there and finished the pastry, talking about nothing important, about the crooked hanging lamp, about how late the snow was melting that year, about the time Marin had taken her students to a music competition on a school bus with a broken heater. The old woman gave a short laugh when Marin reached the part where everyone on the bus had started singing as loudly as they could just to keep warm. Outside, beyond the window clouded with condensation, Cormac stood on the sidewalk with a phone pressed to his ear. He didn't take off his coat, didn't lean against anything, simply stood straight in the middle of the walkway and let people go around him. On the other end of the call, a shipment was being held at a way station to the north, and someone was explaining the situation at far too much length. He listened to all of it. Then he said 3 sentences. No one inside the bakery could hear what those 3 sentences were. They could only see that his lips barely moved, and that afterward he didn't need to say anything else. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his coat pocket, and turned to look inside. Through the glass, he saw his mother laughing. Not the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth, but truly laughing. Her head tipped slightly back, half a pastry still in her hand. He saw the woman sitting across from her brushing crumbs from the red coat with a paper napkin, as naturally as though she had done it 100 times before. He stood out there, separated from them by a single pane of glass, the wind striking the back of his neck. And he didn't go inside. He could have pushed open that door at any moment. It weighed less than 7 pounds. But he didn't. Then a man approached from farther down the sidewalk, carrying a folded sheet of paper in one hand, walking directly toward the bakery before turning inside. He passed 2 empty tables and headed toward the wheelchair. The bell above the door hadn't even stopped ringing when Cormac was suddenly between them. No one had seen him move. He was simply there, standing between the stranger and the wheelchair, his shoulders blocking the way, both hands hanging at his sides, his face giving away nothing. The man stopped short, confused, then lifted the folded paper and asked for directions to a church 4 blocks away. The woman behind the counter pointed outside and told him to keep going straight, then turn left at the second traffic light. The man thanked her, nodded politely to the old woman, and left. The bell over the door rang again. Cormac remained where he was for 1 more beat. Then he exhaled very slowly, 1 long breath that Marin could see from where she was sitting, and she watched his shoulders drop by barely half an inch. The old woman looked up at her son and said, "Why are you standing there blocking all the light?" "It's nothing, Mom," he said. Then he stepped back, opened the door, and went outside to stand on the sidewalk again, on the other side of the glass, where it was colder. In the car, after they had gone a few blocks, the old woman asked Marin where her mother was now. Marin said her mother lived in a nursing home on the west side of the city, and then she added that some days her mother recognized her and some days she didn't. The old woman was quiet for a moment, then told Cormac to turn. He looked at her through the rearview mirror. She said she still had more than 2 hours left of her 4, and she wanted to spend that time somewhere else. Afternoon sunlight spilled into the vinyl-floored hallways at Maplecrest, and in the common room, the upright piano still stood against the wall with its lid closed. Delia Ashby sat in her usual chair by the window, a scarf draped over her shoulders, her hair neatly combed. Marin wheeled Maeve closer and bent down to greet her mother. Delia looked at her with that same polite, distant expression, then turned toward the unfamiliar woman in the red coat sitting beside her and asked if she had a daughter. Maeve reached out and took Delia's hand between both of hers. "Yes," she said. "She's standing right over there." Delia turned her head in the direction Maeve indicated, nodded thoughtfully, and said the girl looked very sweet. Then the 2 women began to talk. Delia told her about a winter concert with snow falling outside the windows, and Maeve said she remembered that day too, even though she had never been there. Maeve talked about a room full of plants and a piano, and Delia nodded and said every house ought to have a piano. Sometimes Delia called Maeve her sister. Sometimes she called her teacher. Maeve never corrected her once. The two old women sat by the window holding hands all afternoon, speaking in sentences that didn't quite fit together, weaving one woman's memories into the other's, and laughing at things no one left in the world could verify anymore. The sunlight moved slowly across the floor, from beneath the legs of the chairs toward the middle of the room. At one point, Delia lifted a hand and stroked Maeve's hair, and Maeve simply let her. At the far end of the hallway, Marin stood with her back to the common room, facing a window that looked out over the grass that still hadn't turned green. She stood straight, her arms hanging at her sides. Her shoulders were trembling. She didn't make a sound. Footsteps on the vinyl floor stopped behind her, about 2 steps away. There was no question. No hand came down on her shoulder. Only a white cloth handkerchief appeared in front of her, folded neatly into a square, and she took it. Cormac didn't say anything. He didn't stay beside her for long. He turned toward the entrance and stood looking out at the parking lot with his back to her, until her shoulders stopped shaking. When Marin went back inside, the two old women were sharing a glass of apple juice one of the staff members had brought them, and Delia was explaining very seriously that this kind of glass had to be held with both hands. Marin sat down beside them without saying anything. Her mother turned, looked at her and said, "Sit up straight, sweetheart. Sitting like that will make your shoulders hurt." Then she turned away and continued talking to Maeve, with no idea what she had just said. Marin lowered her eyes to her hands. The handkerchief was still in her palm, crumpled now. When it was time to leave, Delia didn't want to let go. Maeve had to promise that she would come back another day when she had the time, and she made the promise in the steady voice of someone who still had plenty of time left. On the drive home, night had already fallen, and the streetlights cast bands of yellow through the car, appearing and disappearing as they passed. The old woman dozed off for about 10 minutes before her head tipped onto Marin's shoulder, and Marin didn't move away. She only shifted her shoulder slightly so Maeve could rest more comfortably, then sat perfectly still, one hand holding the blanket over the old woman's lap so it wouldn't slip. In the front seat, Cormac looked into the rearview mirror. He looked longer than he needed to just to know that his mother was asleep. Then he spoke in a low voice, just loud enough for the back seat to hear. "You don't have to pretend anymore. She's asleep." Marin didn't look up. She looked down at the silver hair resting against her shoulder and answered just as quietly, "I'm not pretending." No one said anything else until the car turned onto the paved road leading back to the North Shore. Cormac didn't look into the mirror again, but he drove noticeably slower than he had on the way there, slow enough that 2 cars passed them, and he kept that same speed for the rest of the drive. By the time they got home, the old woman was awake, but she wouldn't let anyone carry her. She said to wheel her in through the side entrance, and as they crossed the threshold, she braced both hands against the arms of the wheelchair and pushed herself upright. Upstairs, Marin helped her out of the red coat, hung it back inside the cloth garment bag, and the old woman told her to leave it there, not to put it away in the closet at the end of the hallway anymore. Then Marin wiped her hands and face with a warm cloth, removed the oxygen tubing so she could breathe on her own for a while, and pulled the thin blanket back over her lap. The old woman was tired. Her lips had already gone pale during the drive, but she refused to lie down. She told Marin to take the small wooden box from the top drawer of the nightstand. Inside were a few odds and ends, an old pair of glasses, a spool of thread, and at the very bottom, resting on faded velvet, a flat silver bracelet. The old woman lifted it with both hands. 3 musical notes had been engraved into its surface, shallowly, and the silver around the engraving had worn brighter than the rest, because someone had rubbed a fingertip over that spot many, many times. She told Marin to hold out her hand. Marin sat down on the low chair beside the wheelchair and offered her left wrist. The old woman slipped the bracelet over it, turned it so the clasp rested on the inside, and held Marin's wrist in her hand for a while. Then she spoke slowly, looking directly into Marin's eyes as she did. "I didn't ask you to take her place. I never thought of that. Not for a single second," she said. "I only asked you to let me be a mother for one more day, and today you gave me that. You gave me more than I ever dared ask for." She said she knew that tomorrow everything would return to the way it had been. "You'll go back to being the woman who brings my trays upstairs, and I'll go back to being the old woman who sits by the window, and that's all right. But this bracelet, you keep. Marin looked down at her wrist. She couldn't speak at first. She sat there while the old woman's hand continued to hold hers. Thin, warm, trembling ever so slightly. Then Marin raised her eyes. "Thank you, Mom." The old woman closed her eyes. 2 lines of tears moved slowly down her face, following the wrinkles around her mouth, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. She only tightened her grip on Marin's hand a little and nodded, several times in a row, as though if she opened her mouth now, nothing that came out would make any sense at all. At the doorway, the door was still slightly open from when they had entered. Cormac stood there, one hand still holding the ring of car keys, the same keys he had picked up from the wooden floor the night before and hadn't set down once since. He saw everything. He saw that silver bracelet resting on another woman's wrist. He saw his mother cry without trying to hide it from anyone, and he heard that word clearly, just once, without being drawn out, without being made into anything more than it was. He didn't step inside. He turned his face away and looked down the dark hallway toward the east wing, and he remained standing there until there was no sound left from inside the room. Then he went downstairs. And that night the light in his first-floor office stayed on until nearly dawn. 3 days later, Bea asked Marin to go down to the supermarket in town for yeast and 2 cases of milk, and she took the small kitchen truck. By the time she pushed the shopping cart into the parking lot, it was already dark, the overhead lamps casting a flat yellow light across the pavement, and a gray van was parked across the back of her vehicle, blocking her in. 2 men got out. One of them took hold of the shopping cart handle as naturally as if he were helping her push it, while the other opened the van door. They didn't shout. They didn't struggle with her in the middle of a crowded parking lot. The first man only leaned close and said quietly into her ear that she should come along without making trouble, and whether she got home early or late was entirely up to her. Marin looked around. An elderly woman was pushing a cart 4 rows away. A little boy sat in a car seat waiting for his mother. Marin thought about screaming, and then she thought about that boy. She stepped into the van. Bea called the house close to 9 o'clock that night, when the kitchen truck was still sitting in the parking lot and Marin wasn't answering her phone. Barrett called Cormac at 10. Before dawn, they knew the van, knew the license plate, knew which direction it had gone, and knew about the warehouse on the west side of Cicero that had kept its lights burning all night, ever since the seals were cut at Pier 9. Barrett said, "We've got 11 men. If we go now, we can make it." Cormac didn't answer. He called Sullivan Rourke. Rourke picked up on the first ring, his voice alert, as though he had been sitting beside the phone all night waiting for it to ring. He said he hadn't touched her. He swore it, that she was sitting in the workers' break room with a cup of coffee and a blanket, and that he had even ordered his men to leave the door open. Then he gave his terms. "You come alone. You bring no one and nothing with you. And you sign over Pier 4. You sign it yourself, in the middle of the warehouse floor, in front of every man I have." Barrett heard it over the speaker and immediately said no, that this wasn't about the pier. Cormac said, "I know." The warehouse in Cicero was tall and empty, smelling of engine oil and metal dust, and Rourke's men stood in 2 rows along the aisle from the rolling door to the middle of the floor, about 20 of them. Cormac walked between those 2 lines alone, empty-handed, his black wool coat buttoned all the way up. No one touched him. Someone whistled once near the end of the line. Rourke waited beside a makeshift wooden table. On it lay a stack of documents already typed, complete with a notarized seal and a witness standing beside them. Rourke said, "I knew you'd come. You could break through the doors of this warehouse in 4 minutes. Your men are better than mine. Everybody knows that. But you still walked in through the front door." Cormac didn't answer. He looked toward the far end of the warehouse, where the break room door stood slightly open and yellow light spilled into the darkness, and he could see the shape of someone sitting in a plastic chair with a blanket draped around her shoulders. Then he bent over the table. He read the first page. He read every word, skipping nothing. He turned to the second. Rourke held out his pen. Cormac didn't take it. He pulled his own pen from his breast pocket and signed. He wrote his name on the final line, slowly, beneath the warehouse lights, with 20 pairs of eyes watching him, and he didn't say a word. The witness stamped the document. Rourke picked up the papers, checked the signature, then gave a faint smile and tilted his head toward the back of the warehouse. Someone opened the break room door. Marin stepped out, still wrapped in the blanket, and she walked between the 2 lines of men with Cormac beside her. And no one said anything until the rolling door came down behind them. In the car, She sat in the front passenger seat. She was still trembling, not because she was afraid anymore, but because the fear had finally left her. After they had driven for a while, she asked what he had just signed. He said, "A pier." She asked how much it was worth. He didn't answer that. She sat quietly for a long time, looking through the window as rows of low buildings passed through the darkness. And then she asked one last question, very softly. "Why would you do that for me?" Cormac kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and he was silent so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, and he said only one sentence. "Because I signed the wrong piece of paper once before." Marin turned to look at him. She didn't understand what he meant. It would take her several more days to understand, and when she finally did, she would wish she had never asked. 4 nights later, every light in the house went out at the same time. It wasn't the flickering kind of failure that came from a weak line, and there was no small pop from the breaker box. Everything simply went dark, and in that darkness, the first thing Marin noticed wasn't the absence of light, but the silence, because the faint hum of the alarm system at the end of the hallway, a sound she had grown so accustomed to that she no longer heard it, had gone silent too. It had gone silent first. She was standing at the foot of the staircase with a stack of towels in her arms, and she understood that in less time than it took to draw a breath, she dropped the towels onto the steps and ran upstairs. The old woman was sitting by the window in the dark, and she had heard something near the side door. Marin didn't explain. She disconnected the oxygen line from the large tank, attached it to the portable cylinder hanging behind the wheelchair, turned the chair around, and pushed. She moved quickly through the dark hallway, pulling the brass key from the pocket of her apron with her free hand, and she remembered that in the entire house, there was only one door whose purpose a stranger couldn't possibly know. The lock scraped as she turned it. She pushed the wheelchair into the glass room, shut the door, turned the key from the inside, then braced her shoulder against the heavy oak bookcase standing beside the wall, and shoved it inch by inch across the floor until it blocked the doorway. The old woman said, "Leave me here, sweetheart. You run." Marin didn't answer. She crouched down in front of the wheelchair, facing the door, and took both of Maeve's hands in hers. Outside, somewhere in the house, there were footsteps. 3 men had come in through the side door. They moved straight ahead, didn't search, didn't turn aside, and that alone said they knew exactly where they were going. They climbed to the 2nd floor by the main staircase. Cormac stopped them at the top. In the darkness, on that narrow landing, everything happened very quickly, and almost without a human voice. There was the sound of a shoulder striking the wooden banister, the sound of a table lamp falling onto the carpet. Barrett called up once from the foyer, one short word. Then there were running footsteps on the stairs, and one of the 3 men was dragged backward and pinned face down on the floor at the turn of the staircase. The 2nd man backed into the sitting room and didn't come out again. The 3rd, standing on the top step, raised his hand, and whatever he was holding left his grip before he could do anything with it. It hit the wooden floor, slid a long way, struck the foot of the banister with a dry crack, then kept sliding down onto the landing and came to rest there. After that sound, the entire house went silent. The lights came back on a few minutes later, one section at a time, and warm yellow light traveled down the 2nd floor hallway like water spilling across a threshold. Cormac walked to the east wing door. He knocked twice. He said his name. From inside came the sound of heavy wood scraping slowly across the floor, stopping and starting several times before it was finally done. Then the turn of a key. The door opened. He stood in the doorway and looked into the glass room he had avoided for 12 years, until a few nights ago, the room with the covered piano and the dead plants, and he saw his mother sitting in her wheelchair in the middle of it. In front of her, with her back to the doorway, a woman was kneeling, both arms spread wide, gripping the sides of the wheelchair and shielding her. She stayed on her knees even after the door opened, even after she heard his voice. She only turned her head to look back, her hair coming loose from its knot, and she didn't stand right away. Cormac remained there with one hand still resting on the doorframe. He had seen many people shield others in his life, people who were paid to do it, people he had chosen himself and put on salary, but none of them had ever been someone who could have walked away and no one would have blamed her for it. He didn't say anything. He crossed the room, lowered himself onto one knee beside her, and peeled her fingers away from the sides of the wheelchair one by one, because she was gripping so tightly that she couldn't make herself let go. That was the moment he knew exactly what he was feeling, and he also knew that knowing it this late wasn't going to help anything. Outside the room, at the foot of the stairs, Barrett was standing and looking toward the far end of the first-floor hallway, where the office door stood wide open, and inside, behind a painting that had been taken down and left leaning against the wall, the safe door was standing open about a hand's breadth. Near dawn, Barrett finished reviewing the portion of footage still preserved in the system cache, the part that hadn't been erased in time. The alarm system hadn't failed. It had been shut down from the control panel in the first-floor linen room, disabled using the exact code that only 3 people in the entire house knew, and it had been turned off before anyone came anywhere near the fence. Barrett handed Cormac the slip of paper where he had written down the times, and he said the name. Cormac read that piece of paper for a very long time, much longer than it took to read a single name. Then he folded it and said, "Call her up here." Gwendolyn Pike entered the study with her apron removed and draped over one arm, her hair still pinned into the same neat bun she had worn every morning for 30 years, and she didn't wait for anyone to ask. She placed her ring of keys on the desk, the side door key, the storage key, the linen room key, arranging them neatly before saying, "Yes, it was me." She said it so calmly that Marin, standing in the doorway with a tray of coffee she hadn't yet had time to set down, nearly dropped a tray for the second time in her life inside that house. Cormac didn't shout. He asked why. Gwendolyn looked directly at him, and for the first time in 30 years, she didn't lower her eyes in front of someone bearing the Brennan name. She said she had a son. His name was Hollis. He worked the morning shift at Pier 9. He had been there for 2 years and 7 months, and he died there, on the same morning as a worker named Walter Ashby, beneath the same thing that came crashing down. Marin froze in the doorway. Gwendolyn didn't turn to look at her. She said she had waited. She had waited for a phone call, waited for a letter, waited for someone to knock on her door and tell her they were sorry. Nothing came, so she went asking questions. They told her that her son hadn't been listed on the shift roster that day. She showed them his safety jacket with his name stitched into it. She showed them his access badge, and they still told her that his name wasn't on the timesheet. "Ma'am, perhaps she was mistaken." She said, "I stood at that counter for 4 hours, and in the end, they called security to escort me out." Then she continued. Her voice still didn't rise, but both of her hands had closed around the back of the chair in front of her. She said that several months earlier, one night, when the lady of the house was delirious from medication, Gwendolyn had stayed beside her bed all night on watch, and while she was drifting in and out, Maeve had spoken 2 words. Pier 9. Only those 2 words. I had lived in this house for 30 years and didn't know whose floors I was polishing. From that day on, she started asking again. She asked the old employees, the people who had been around before, and she learned there was a file. She learned where it was kept. I don't know how to open the safe. I only know the alarm code, because I'm the one who resets that code every winter. They promised me they would take the papers and leave. Give them to the newspapers, to the prosecutors, to anyone. I didn't care. As long as somebody wrote my son's name down somewhere. I had no idea what they were bringing with them, and I thought the lady of the house was going to be at the hospital that night, because her follow-up appointment was clearly scheduled for that evening. I wrote it in the book with my own hand. She stopped. Then she turned her head, and this time she looked at Marin, and only then did her voice finally break, not with tears, but in the way something breaks after carrying too much weight for too long. You sat and sang to her. You took her out to eat pastries. She put her bracelet on your wrist. And I polished their shoes for 30 years. 30 years. And my son's name never got written on a single piece of paper. No one said anything. Marin set the coffee tray down on the small table in the corner of the room, and she lowered it very gently, as though she were afraid of letting one more thing fall inside that room. Cormac stood up. He didn't call anyone. He didn't touch the ring of keys on the desk. He only said, "Go to the staff room." Gwendolyn asked what he intended to do with her. He said, "I don't know yet." Then he added, his voice noticeably rougher than it had been at the beginning, "Don't go anywhere tonight, and leave the keys there." When the door closed behind her, Cormac remained standing in the same place for a long time. Then he turned toward the painting, leaning crookedly against the wall, and looked at the safe door, still standing open by exactly a hand's breadth. That afternoon, Marin was told to put the study back in order, because there was no one left in the house to give the job to. She set the desk lamp upright, gathered the papers scattered across the floor, and when she went to move the painting back into place, she saw that the safe door was still slightly open. There was no money inside, no gold. Nothing like the things people imagined would be kept in the safe of a house owned by a man like him. There was only a thick blue file, about 2 finger joints deep, with a small handwritten label stuck to the spine bearing 2 words, Pier 9. Marin hadn't intended to open it. She stood there with the file in her hands for a length of time she would never later try to measure, and then she opened it. The first page was a technical report. The hoisting cable on crane number 2 was 14 months overdue for inspection. 3 separate requests for replacement had been pushed into the following quarter, and in the final conclusion, all of those details disappeared, leaving only 5 words. Operator error during handling. The next page was a list. 11 lines, each with a name, an amount of money, a recipient's signature, and a printed statement agreeing not to file a complaint, not to make public statements, and not to provide information to any third party. The 4th line read Ashby, Walter J. Beside her father's name was an amount, and the recipient's signature box was blank because no one had ever come to his family asking them to sign. On the final page was an order closing the case. A single sheet, 3 lines, and in the lower right corner was a signature Marin had already seen at the bottom of the papers in the warehouse in Cicero, Cormac Brennan. She found him in the glass room. She didn't knock. She set the file down on top of the covered piano, opened it to the page with the list, and asked him one question, only one, in the voice of someone who no longer had anything left to lose inside that house. How long have you known who I am? He stood up. He didn't look down at the file because he didn't need to. Since the night you broke the cup in the hallway. She asked why he hadn't sent her away. He said, I thought about it. She asked whether he had signed that paper. He said, I signed it. He didn't add a single word to soften what he had just admitted. He said, I was 28. My father had been dead for 6 months. 3 files were put on my desk the same morning, and I was told this was what had to be done, that anyone sitting in this chair would do the same thing, and I did exactly what I had been taught to do. Marin listened to all of it. Then she picked up the file, and because her hands were shaking, several papers slipped loose from the clip, and something else fell out from the middle of the folder and landed on the floor, a small leather notebook worn at all 4 corners. She bent down and picked it up. She opened it. Inside were 11 names, written by hand in the same handwriting she had seen on the folded sheet inside the envelope that night. The sheet bearing the name of the bakery in Bridgeport. Beside each name was a long column of small check marks, neat and regular, 1 month following the next, stretching across 3 years. On the 4th line, beside her father's name, the column continued steadily until the most recent month and then stopped, with the last box left blank. Marin looked up. She couldn't ask anything else. Cormac looked at the notebook in her hands and said slowly that for the past 3 years, every month, he had done it himself, counted the money himself, folded it himself, sent it through the mail with no name, no letter, no one in the organization knowing, and his mother didn't know either. He said there had been nothing last month because all available cash had been locked down while the pier was being taken over, and he couldn't withdraw an amount like that without 3 people seeing it. He added softly, I was going to make it up at the end of this month. Then he said the last thing without looking at her. Don't mistake it for atonement. I'm not buying anyone's silence. I'm buying my own sleep. And even now, I still haven't paid enough for it. Marin stood there for a very long time. She thought about the blue visitor ledger at Maplecrest, and the 3 words pressed so deeply into the page, nothing at all. She thought about the first rule they had read to her on the day she arrived, that no one in this house asked where the money came from, and she thought that now she finally had. She placed the notebook on top of the piano. Then she removed the silver bracelet from her left wrist, turning the clasp outward exactly the way the old woman had taught her, and laid it beside the notebook. I can't keep this anymore. Then she walked out. She walked all the way to the main road in the dark and caught the last bus back to Bridgeport. Wes opened the door close to 2 o'clock in the morning, saw the cloth suitcase in his sister's hand, and didn't ask a single question. He simply took the suitcase from her, made up the bed for her, then put on his coat and sat outside on the shared apartment landing until morning. The meeting took place on Thursday morning, on the top floor of the glass tower, in the very same room where, several months earlier, a port inspector had signed his papers and left, closing the door behind him very softly. This time, the man sitting at the head of the table was Desmond Fahey. He was already there before Cormac arrived, and in front of him lay a sheet of paper yellowed around the edges. a power of attorney Cormac's father had signed back when the family owned only 3 peers and 40 trucks, authorizing the Council of Branch Heads to vote to remove the man in charge if he acted against the common interests of the family. Desmond didn't raise his voice. He said he had held Cormac in his arms before the boy could even walk. Then he placed 3 things on the table. The first was a copy of the transfer agreement for Pier 4, bearing Cormac's own signature and a notarized seal, signed on the floor of an outsider's warehouse in front of 20 outsiders. The second was the report from the night the power went out at the estate. The third was a short list of unusual cash withdrawals made over the past 3 years that no one had ever been able to explain. He asked the branch heads only one question: whether they still wanted to follow a man who had traded away an entire pier for a cleaning woman. They voted by signing their names. 6 signatures. Nolan Frayne sat at the far end of the table, picked up his pen and set it down again 3 times. And in the end, he signed too, without daring to lift his head. Cormac didn't say a single word throughout that meeting. He stood, pushed his chair neatly back against the table, and walked out. By the time he reached the lobby, Barrett's phone could no longer unlock the elevator to the upper floor. That same morning, B called Marin. She managed only 3 sentences before her voice broke. She said the lady of the house was very weak now, that she had needed the large oxygen tank all through the night, and that this morning she had insisted on going into the glass room instead of staying in bed. Marin took 2 buses and then walked the entire paved road leading into the North Shore, arriving sometime after noon. In the glass room, a low bed had been placed beside the row of tall windows. The old woman lay turned toward the light, her hair neatly combed, with the red coat draped over the back of the chair beside her. When Marin entered, she opened her eyes, smiled, and said, "I knew you would come home." Marin sat down on the low chair, took her hand, and said, "I'm home." The old woman told her to sit closer. Then she began to speak. "Do you know why I chose you?" she asked. Marin said it was because she walked with her left shoulder slightly lower. The old woman shook her head. "No." She said she had sent someone to find Marin's family more than a year earlier. She knew her father's name. She knew where her mother was living. Even knew the name of the nursing home. She knew her younger brother was planning to leave school. That job advertisement, I had them place it at the exact employment center you visited every week, and I offered 3 times the usual salary to make sure you would apply. Your application, I approved it myself." She continued, her voice breaking between phrases because her breath was short, saying that the file in the safe hadn't been put there by her son. She had told Nolan Frayne to make a copy and bring it home to her. She said that boy was afraid of everyone in the company, but he wasn't afraid of her, because in 30 years, she was the only person in that house who had never threatened him even once. Then she said she had been the one who put the file inside the safe, and she had been the one who pressed the brass key into Marin's hand, because she knew that once that one door opened, everything else would begin opening on its own. Marin couldn't speak. She managed only one question. "Why didn't you do it yourself?" The old woman looked out through the windows, where the dead plants still stood in their pots, and she said, "Because I'm his mother." She said, "I stood by and watched my husband teach him how to sign papers like that before he was even old enough to drive, and I said nothing. I stood there and watched him sign them, and I still said nothing. For 30 years, I believed silence was the way I protected him. I was wrong. Silence only protected me." She said, "I wasn't brave enough to destroy my son with my own hands. So I invited the truth into this house, dressed it in an apron, and sat there begging it to call me Mom." She tightened her hand around Marin's and said, "Don't be angry with me." Marin bent down, pressed her forehead against the back of the old woman's hand, and said, "I'm not angry." That afternoon, Maeve asked her to put on some music. Marin placed the piano record on the turntable, moved the lever, and lowered the needle. This time, it played. It passed the place where it had stopped before, kept going, carried on through the entire side of the record, complete, until the needle slipped into the innermost groove, and all that remained was the steady hiss. The old woman listened to all of it with her eyes closed, her hand still resting inside Marin's. The following morning, she passed away in her sleep, her face turned toward the window, and when Marin woke in the low chair beside her, there wasn't a single sound left in the room. 3 days after the funeral, Marin went back to the glass room to gather the old woman's things, and the leather-bound notebook was still lying on top of the covered piano exactly where she had left it that night. She opened it so she could put it back inside the file, and this time she read slowly, following the columns instead of the rows, and she counted. She counted 12 columns of check marks. The official list contained only 11 names. She turned back through the pages. On the very last line, at the bottom of the page, there was no full name at all. Only 2 initials written much smaller than the lines above, as though the person who wrote them had known he wasn't allowed to write the whole name. H. P. And the column of check marks beside those 2 initials ran steadily through all 3 years, 1 every month, without a single month missing. Even during the months when everything in that house had been falling apart. Marin sat down on the brick step at the far end of the room and remained there for a very long time with the notebook open across her lap. That afternoon, she went down to the staff room. Gwendolyn Pike was packing her belongings into a cardboard box. 30 years of her life inside that house fitting into exactly 1 box. Marin didn't say anything. She only placed the notebook on the table, opened it to the final page, and pointed to the 2 initials. The older woman bent over and looked. She read them, then read them again. She asked what the column meant, and Marin said, "Each mark is 1 month, ma'am." Then Marin told her that the envelope she had been receiving for the past 3 years had been sent by the man downstairs, mailed without a name, and that he couldn't write her son's full name on any official paper, because doing so would expose the fact that the timesheets had been altered. Gwendolyn straightened, still holding a half-folded towel in one hand. Then she lifted her other hand to cover her mouth. For 30 years she had stood straight in that house, 30 years without lowering her eyes before anyone, and all of it collapsed in the space of a single breath. She dropped heavily onto the edge of the bed, the towel slipping from her hand, and she began to sob aloud, the broken sobbing of a woman who had held it back for so long that when it finally came out, it no longer knew how to come out cleanly. Marin sat beside her, placed one hand against her back, and stayed there until darkness fell. During those same days, in the office that was now the only place in the building he still had the right to enter, Cormac read the Pier 9 file again from the first page to the last, without skipping a single line, something he hadn't done in all those years because he had believed he already knew what was inside it. And he found a name he had never paid attention to before. Ray Muldoon, a port safety inspector, the man who had written 3 words by hand in the margin of the technical report. "I won't sign." He truly hadn't signed it. Inside the file was a copy of the company vehicle assignment sheet for that week, and the car that had been sent for him that day had been dispatched under an order bearing a signature in the lower right corner, Desmond Fahey. The incident had been recorded as an accident, and no one had ever investigated it to the end. Cormac sat motionless in front of that page for a very long time, remembering that Desmond had been the one who placed those 3 files on his desk the morning he was 28. The next morning, Cormac called the federal prosecutor's office. They offered him a deal before he had even finished his second sentence. Give them the entire network, the names, the routes, the books, and he would receive full immunity from prosecution. Not a single day in prison. He could sign the agreement there and walk out through the front door that very evening. He listened to everything. Then he said no. He said, "None of the 11 people on that list were asked what they wanted. I don't need to be asked either." The first name he gave them was Desmond Fahey. Weeks later, in the hallway of the federal courthouse, the 2 men passed each other, and the older man was the one who stopped first, opening his mouth as though he were about to say something about family, about 30 years, about who had carried whom in his arms when he was a child. Cormac didn't let him finish. He only said, "You taught me that a name on paper was an expense. I was slow to learn, but I learned it in the end." Then he kept walking. He didn't turn around, and that was the 3rd time he broke the final rule of that house, the rule that said no one surprised Mr. Brennan twice, because this time, the person he surprised was himself. The following spring, in a small lakeside town just across the Michigan state line, there was a music room that opened every Saturday morning on the ground floor of an old building overlooking the water, and on the wooden sign hanging outside the door, someone had painted the words Rosalind Music Program by hand. That morning, 14 children sat cross-legged in a circle on the wooden floor, each of them holding 2 wooden spoons, while Marin stood in the middle of the circle counting the beat with her hands. Every few measures, one child would strike at the wrong moment, and the whole room would burst into laughter. Then everyone would start again from the beginning, and every time it was a different child missing a different beat. Wes had gone back to school the previous fall, and every Saturday morning he arrived half an hour early to set out the chairs. In the corner of the room near the window, Delia Ashby sat in an armchair with her hands resting in her lap, and today was a good day. She watched her daughter moving around the wooden floor, and when Marin looked up, Delia called her by name, the right name, and said, "You're counting a little too fast, sweetheart." The door opened halfway through the session. The man standing in the doorway was much thinner than before, his hair longer, a faded cloth coat on his shoulders, and outside there was no black car parked along the curb and no one waiting for him. In his hands was only a cardboard box holding his personal belongings, and resting on top of the box was a handwritten piece of music, with 14 crooked signatures at the bottom of the page, something the children had signed during the winter, and mailed away without any of them knowing for certain whether it would ever reach him. The children kept tapping their spoons. Marin crossed the room without hurrying and stopped in front of him. She held out the silver bracelet engraved with 3 musical notes. He asked, "Did she leave this for me?" Marin said, "No, she left it for her daughter. I was only keeping it until today." He took the bracelet, slipped it over her wrist, turned the clasp toward the inside, and did it slowly, exactly the way someone does when something has finally come to an end. This story leaves behind something very simple, that regret is the cheapest thing one person can offer someone they have hurt, because regret doesn't require us to pay any price at all. Truth is different. Truth is expensive. It can take away property, reputation, and even years of a person's freedom. But only the truth can give a lost person back their name, and only the truth can give those who remain alive the right to begin again. In this life, the most frightening thing isn't that we were once wrong. It is that we leave that wrong sitting silently in a drawer year after year and tell ourselves that it happened a long time ago. Nothing in the past is ever truly past as long as someone is still waiting to be called by the right name. If today's story touched something in you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the person who came to your mind so that every day we can bring you more stories worth hearing. How did this story make you feel? Which person will stay in your memory the longest? And if you were in their place, what would you choose? Please leave a few lines in the comments. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.